In our last sermon, I gave an introduction to help us understand better what is the sacred. And I used the examples of cycles and seasons to show us a temporal shift or a phase of time. And what I concluded is that time seems to be set into a motion and for the purpose of change and for transformation. So what we have to realize is that transformation in itself seems to have a sacred purpose. That change is a vital part of the design of creation, and that within the design of creation, and I mean creation in the sense of our planet and nature, and I have used these characteristics of the seasons to show us these very patterns of transformation as the material world of nature is changing around us all the time and through the whole yearly cycle. And what is most interesting here is that this very same phenomenon of change, which happens in nature and throughout the cosmos, is happening within all of us. In pretty much almost very close to the same kind of ways. So I tried to explain that at the beginning of the winter solstice, we rise out of the dark womb, like when we're birthed into the world. And then as children, we spring into life, right? And as we grow into adults, we mature into the summer solstice, which is our full bloom. And then as we age, we slowly move through the fall season and eventually back into that unconscious state of winter. So now we have a general understanding of sacred time. We can move towards the other half, and this is, of course, going to be understanding sacred space. So to do this, I would like to return back to the Holy Scriptures and start at the first paragraph of Genesis. It is going to be Genesis 1 through 2, and I'm using the New King James Version of the Bible, just so for reference. But in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And that's the end of the verse, looks like. So the verse is showing us essentially that creation, at this point, you can kind of understand it as being like unconscious. And this represents like by the dark void, right? By the darkness and the void. And at this point, where there is no form, we can understand that this is like pure space, okay? Which, what I mean by this is there's nothing identifying about it, nothing sacred about it, just simply like infinite space, right? And then as we go on, Genesis 1, 3 through 5, God said, "Let there be light," and then there was light. And God saw the light, and that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. So that the evening and the morning were the first day. So it would be this verse, we can see that out of the dark unconscious, okay, the light brought consciousness. And at that moment, what was just space, like we had said, with no orientation, with just pure darkness, suddenly there was like a flame inside of a black room. And imagine for a moment that whenever you do find yourself in such a dark space, like when you're holding your hands out in front of you and you can't see anything, right? You can't even see your own hand. And it's almost like you can't even tell that you're looking directly at anything. Like whether you see your hands or what, you can't even tell what direction you're looking really. And that seems to be because our eyes, they have no direction really to guide them. There's nothing to orient them. There's nothing to pull the attention so that they have a place to go to. But then even with the smallest flicker, if you could imagine, we would immediately orient ourselves towards that glow, right? Your eyes would go right towards where where that flame is. So a small flame in the middle of this black room would completely transfigure the space. So you would go from this feeling of disorientation to an immediate hyper-focus towards that light that you're seeing. Because everything that's going on in our neurological systems would recognize this as a place, as basically a place, rather than just empty, dark space, right? So now there's a place rather than space. So this place where there is now light has become a place of orientation. It is the only thing that means anything in the midst of that emptiness. And therefore, since it is the start and since it is the point of orientation, it becomes kind of like the pole, which will now illuminate anything else that revolves around it. Okay? Therefore, we can almost consider that as like what I would consider sacred space. So it's an orientation. It's a beginning. It's a place in which things will form around. Because it marks a center and it marks an origin where all things rotate or will come to rotate, we can almost see it as basically the center of the world. We could kind of metaphorically say that. It's the place where all things will evolve into their purpose and into meaning. So in other words, it is sacred because it is suddenly and surprisingly revealing an intention that God had put forth. Okay? So God had just suddenly sparked creation, and therefore there must be a mysterious intention that is attached to that spark, right? What is sacred, or what we have said, appears to be the patterns that were first set in motion in the beginning, is what seemingly preserves whatever that intention might be. Because now in some way, by these motions, or by these patterns and points, they are trying to reveal to us the meaning behind God's original intention for creation. All right? This idea may appear a little almost too simple at first, but perhaps even a bit irrelevant, especially when it comes to trying to understand spirituality. However, it is often these kinds of fundamental principles that we do tend to take for granted. And they're fundamental and they are sacred in the sense that they have far more of an impression on us than what you probably realize. Now, I want to use an example to show you what I mean by that. I want to show you just how powerful this idea of sacred space is and how fundamental it is to our own psychological and biological functions, all right? So, I want you to imagine for a moment that you're lost in the woods. Now, I'm not sure if this has actually happened to whoever's watching this, and particularly if it happened to anyone, like, let's say, before GPS and before Google Maps and before we had our phones and all of that. But instead, you're lost in the woods and there are no roads, there are no trails, just trees, and, well, even if you had a cell phone, let's pretend like you didn't have service, right? So, at this point, you have no idea which direction is this way or that, right? And all you see are trees on pretty much all sides of you. No trail, nothing recognizable. What would happen? What would be happening to you in this moment? Okay? What would be happening? What I mean by that, like, what would you be feeling? Okay, if you could imagine yourself in this position. Most likely, there'd be a huge wave of anxiety, right? You would be flooded with this sense or this feeling of pure anxiety because you have realized that you're completely lost. So whatever or wherever you thought your landscape was, wherever you thought you were, is gone. You have no idea where to go, which direction to even begin to find your way back, right? Now imagine that after a while, after you calm down a bit, you notice one large pine tree off in the distance, okay? The tree clearly stands out from all the rest of the trees. And now suddenly you have a place to orient yourself, right? And you think, if I can use this tree as a marker, maybe I could venture in different directions to find the pathway back, all right? And if I keep my eye on the tree, I at least won't become more lost than you probably already are, right? So the tree has now become a place, all right? It's a place of orientation in the midst of the open and meaningless space of trees that are all surrounding it. And it appears in some way as the sacred would, as what we're talking about, the sacred would appear, because at least for that moment, it acts as that central pole. It's that central identification, really, that's kind of in that sea of chaos. So it orients you, or it guides you to fulfill a purpose and to fill a meaning, all right? And that is, your meaning is basically to find your way back home, all right? To find your way back to your meaning, to your purpose, to your home. And this is not only fundamentally true in the objective or the physical world, but this same phenomenon is actually just as true in the psychological world as well, okay? So, I want to share another example, and it's going to prove this point, and this one might be a little bit harder for some. So imagine again, you have a house, right? You have your children, you have your husband or wife, and everything is as it should be. The American dream, okay? And this hub, which is your home and family, is the center of your world. It's the only thing that really matters to you at all, which means everything else that exists is just kind of revolving around that, right? It's not important, or it's not as important. And then I hate to even say it, because this might be really true for some of us, but what if something were to suddenly happen to one of those most precious people in your life, and they're no longer present with you? These kinds of tragic experiences will often leave us with a sense of devastation and shock, right? And if you or anyone you know have ever had this happen, especially if it's happened abruptly, there is a real sense of feeling lost. And that's because the people and relationships in our life are pretty much what make up that psychological landscape, all right? It makes up our psychological landscape. They really give us a sense of who we are, a sense of we, a sense of us, and it really kind of grounds that sense of I. They give us our identity and a way to be confirmed, to know that we are real and connected. Otherwise, we would be in a world that's basically just full of strangers, right? You may as well visit a country where nobody speaks your language. And I have a friend, Casey, actually, that experienced this when he visited Spain. And he kind of, for the most part, expressed to me just how much of a relief it was just to hear anyone say something that he understood in the least. So the power of relationship and connection is no joke, right? We may feel it, we may take it for granted, but we need connection. And that connection is basically our psychological map. It's our everything. And when that landmark is suddenly removed, those same neurological signifiers which were firing off in the woods, are going to be firing off again in the same way. And we'll absolutely have a sense of feeling lost, right? So the deeper you take this idea, is the closer you're going to get to the sacred. Because the sacred is that intention, it's the invisible meaning, which within the relationship is being preserved and revealed to you. It is felt, it is realized, but you can't quite grasp it entirely. The sacred is that which is unseen, because it's the meaning. It is why you feel what you feel when you're lost, because you are being separated from the center, from the original intention. And therefore anxiety is that driving force that is calling you back to the center, back to its meaning and to its purpose. We can think of the sacred as a center pole, like we said, and the central identifier for the collective, for all humanity. This is the reason why so many primitives actually thought that the sun was God, since they understood that the sun is that fiery ball in the midst of the darkness, right? That flickering light in which from it pretty much all life is given. And so, like I've been saying, these realities which we experience and we see within the outside or the objective world, such as the sun, the moon, the stars, large trees, and so on, that in the physical world they show themselves as kind of what I'd like to call sacred identifiers or sacred spaces, but only because they're the impressions of that hidden divine space or sacred that we're talking about. So in other words, they're the physical manifestation of the inner and invisible divine reality. Then we must ask, if these are the physical impressions of the divine, then what are those non-physical impressions? Is there such a thing as sacred space within our own conscious minds? Does our conscious hold the same characteristics within the invisible world, that is the invisible world of our psyche, as what we experience in the outside or the material world? So I would say that most of us are probably familiar with the term ego, right? The ego, as I understand it, at least from the psychological works of Carl Jung, is the vantage point of where our own personal consciousness is functioning, right? Jung describes the ego as a central part of our psyche, which gives us our identity and our sense of I, me, or mine. Okay, that's the ego. So for all intents and purposes, and as it relates to what we've been talking about, we can almost understand the ego as that central pole. We may even say, from our own perspective, that our ego acts like the center of our own personal universe, because it is from this center that we filter, understand, discriminate, and value all the purpose and all the meaning to all things. There's no skirting around that. But then what exists on the periphery, the space that exists or orbits around the center, is what Jung calls the personal unconscious. And then even on the outside of the personal unconscious is when Jung starts to get into the collective unconscious. But now I'm going to try to go through this slowly and as clearly as I can, since I know that many of these terms and ideas are probably new to many people that could be hearing this. But what I'm presenting is that you are, in some sense, experiencing the recreation of Genesis within your very own consciousness. So the light in the darkness, this is consciousness, right? It's like the consciousness amid the unconscious, okay? It's what you know. And that's what you know, of course, amidst what you don't know, that vast sea of what you don't know. Your ego is essentially a light in that darkness, since your ego is the only place of conscious orientation. It's the only place that allows you to psychologically differentiate yourself from that void of infinite possibility. So I know that many of us understand the ego as a negative aspect, especially to those who are more familiar with Eastern practices and Eastern religions, right? And there's a good reason for this. But I want to present the idea that without the stability of the ego, we would basically be subject to all of that infinite possibility. Which, as I said before, it'd be kind of like, that'd be kind of like the empty space of nothingness, which horribly enough is kind of what we would consider insanity. A schizophrenic, for instance, has a fractured personality, which means that mentally they are kind of like all over the place, right? They can't settle or rest properly within that stable or identified ego. So again, for all intents and purposes, we can understand the ego being relevant almost to sacred space, or in the least, it is that part of the psychological space that we're talking about, which would best define basically that place of orientation in the midst of the darkness. And if we were to become a higher form of ourselves, right? And if we were to reflect the characteristics of God, or what Carl Jung would call the integration of the self, that such characteristics would have to concretize or solidify within that ego personality. Okay, so whatever's above would have to come down, and it would have to rest within that ego personality. Okay, since non-ego is pretty much the same as non-identity. All right. Now, it's important to note here, since I know for some of you, perhaps maybe all kinds of alarms are going off. So I'm not saying that the ego is as at all sacred, okay? Only that it is relevant to, or should I say, it is the psychological vehicle for which we move towards the sacred. And again, in the psychological sense. So as I had said, think of the ego acting like the light in the darkness, right? However, we must think of this light as moonlight, all right? Because the ego is by no means the source of the light. The ego only reflects the light that emanates from that source. And with this in mind, we can understand why Eastern practices put a lot of focus on emptying one's ego, right? Which we do see that in Christianity as well. That's the kenosis. But essentially, if anyone wants to correct me on this, feel free. But the idea is that because the ego reflects the light of God, we can assume that there are then shadows which are being cast, right? And the principal idea is that what we see as a reality may not be true reality, but the mere illusions of these shadows. So for anyone who is familiar with Plato, will also recognize the idea in the story of Plato's cave. And so when we open our eyes beyond the ego, let's say, when we crawl out of the cave, we realize that what we were looking at all this time were only the shadows on the cave walls. But by leaving the cave, we see the source for what it truly is. So I've personally found a lot of truth in this. And honestly, we all experience this kind of phenomenon every time we realize something that we didn't realize before. Okay? And we'll say things like, oh yeah, I get it. I never saw it like that, right? But then the question is, well, how did you see it before? I suppose what we saw was sort of a shadow of the truth, right? It was something like only a part of the whole, or in the least, it was a representation or appearance of some kind of a truth. But it wasn't the full truth. It wasn't the full nature of that truth. I cannot fully determine, however, what it would be like if we were to completely separate ourselves from that ego. If we were to try to escape that middle state of consciousness, either we would be like all space, which is nothingness, or all source, which would be God himself. And though I have come to experience, and what has been said by many theologians, if you wish to know God, you must come to know thyself. But the knowing only seems to constitute a knowing or seeing the light or the source for what it is, and acting then in proper accordance to that source. We are something created by that source, and nonetheless, we are called to be made in the image of that source. But at the point whereas we are unable to see all truth for what it is, we seem only to be a reflection of that source, at least in part, just as the moon and the earth reflects the sun, right? And therefore, within our own psychological landscape, we will have our own shadows, whether we want to admit that or not. So you find this idea also within the Eastern Orthodox idea of theosis, okay? In some sense, this theological understanding calls us to enter all these patterns and phases, all right, all the seasons, because in their own mysterious way, we're called to participate in the becoming of God, as if we're to become like God himself, and in some sense uniting with him in that way, right? And if we look at the larger vision of God, we can recognize that he is not only the source of light, but that he constitutes that dark space as well. So in other words, at least what I found with the Christian practice, early Christian practice, is that God is understood as what we would call basically just being itself, right? But then also non-being. That which is conscious, then God also rests in that place in which we would call the unconscious. That which is manifest and that which is not yet manifest, but remains always a possibility. So what this means, if we can discover ourselves more fully, if we discover what parts of ourselves are hidden and unconscious, we add to that conscious identity. We're adding what was unconscious to us prior, right? But we do not realize it because it begins to integrate or join together within our conscious. And then we become, if we pay attention, we realize that it's now part of our conscious landscape, right? So then what we call the ego conscious willfully recognizes its own shadow, and it brings it into the light. And by doing so, we no longer see distortions. We no longer are fooled by those shadows, but instead we can stand between, and we can see both the source and the reflection for what it is. We can see ourselves for who we are. The shadows then begin to disappear. Can you see how this process is kind of an imitation of Genesis? So when the light is brought into the dark, it makes meaning out from that dark. When the light is brought into the unconscious, what was hidden is brought into the light of our consciousness. Truth is then revealed, meaning is then revealed, purpose is then revealed. So I'll share a personal example with you. Since I could ask myself, why am I a perfectionist, right? Maybe it's because I have ADHD and it's caused me to make a lot of mistakes in my life, and this has led me to believe that I was unintelligent or untalented. But perhaps what I had thought was a mental disability has given me gifts in different ways, right? Ways that I've yet to know. So when those of us become aware of those kinds of truths, when we find our purpose and our strengths, it brings light into the darkness. What we could not see before, now we can see. Then perhaps we can be more kind to ourselves and know that our struggles may have come because we're just simply misaligned with whatever our purpose is, right? So at this point, I'm going to try to sum everything up here now, okay? And I'm going to go through a few more examples in the hopes of making clear the most important point in all of this, right? And hopefully I was able to show just how important and essential the idea of sacred space is to our physical and our psychological existence. But what we have to also become aware of is that this space tends to change, shift, and move, right? Just like the buildings and the homes can burn to the ground, and just like a person can change their ego personality and become someone different than they once were. This, I would say, is the effects of sacred time, right? And for the purpose of what? For transformation. So if sacred space disappears and then reappears as something other, it's because it's working together with that sacred time. Then what lies between, as a result of both of these working together, is what we could say is the most sacred of all. It may be the very thing that these two natures are always striving to reveal to us, right? Now, let's return again to our solar system example. Like I said earlier, the primitives often considered God to be the sun. But if this is how we see God, we miss the beauty for the whole solar system, right? I mean, like how the whole system works, how I talked about the patterns which make up the seasons and all of that, right? So then should we look at the system with all those parts and all those rotations, and should we say that that is the most holy and the most fullest understanding of God? Well, the problem with that idea, if we simply look at just the system and all of the moving parts, then we might miss the outcome of that system. We miss the life that incidentally emerged with having the perfect balance of all those celestial movements. But then again, perhaps even the life that seemed to incidentally emerge is not yet as deep as this mystery goes. But yet, what could lie even more hidden than that? What could be even more than the mystery of the physical appearance of life? What is it that is the most holy of the holies? What about if we consider the invisible force which seems to hold all things in relationship with each other? You can't even see this force, but it is the most fundamental, since without it, nothing would be held together. Nothing would be suspended in its rotation. Maybe this is just dark matter, but maybe it's much more than that. Perhaps it's more like intention, possibility, maybe even meaning, right? If you want to understand what is sacred, it seems to me to be in the intention. It's in that force. The meaning and purpose that pretty much underlies everything. It's not the thing or space. It's not even the system, or which we call time. But it's that which invisibly flows around both. It is the force that calls upon all things to be in relationship with one another, to be in love with one another. So that what we find is, it's not, let's say, one stroke of the paintbrush. It's not one note in the song. It's not one tree or one rock that sits within the entire valley. It's what captures you when you put them all together. It's revealed in the beauty that emanates from it. And each of these pieces, in their own proper place, reflecting their best intention, when the stars align, these are the corner pieces, the cornerstones that hold together what that intention is. And it is the real mystery, because each aspect, as itself, is nothing in comparison to the whole. But the whole is unknown without all the aspects. If you can understand this, then you can understand love. We can think of marriage. We often hear it said that two joined together as one. But though they are one, yet they remain as two. However, together they become something more than they once were. So you can come to know Jack and you can come to know Jill. But you can also come to know Jack and Jill as a couple. So what was that space between them before they joined as one? Before they came to know each other? Perhaps we can understand this the same way that we can understand that dark space or that void, right? Whereas what appears at first to be nothing, but at the same time is holding the possibility of everything. This, it may be invisible to us. We can't physically see what potential actually is. We can't prove that it's something that's actually there. Not really. However, we can imagine it. So the question is, what's most real? Since from our imaginations, pretty much everything has proceeded forth. Jack and Jill proved this to be true, since by the coming of knowing each other brings a light to that void that's between them. And the more they come to know each other, the more they become them. Then there is even more. Since the void between becomes them together, that now manifests another. And that child becomes the fruit of that togetherness. A child who again becomes the embodiment of potential. And a whole new life, a whole new and upcoming generation emerges. And this is first and foremost made possible by the imagination, from the realm of intention and purpose. And yet again, Genesis proceeds on, right? So what then rests in your unconscious? What rests in that void of potential? Are you really who you are? Do you even know who you are? Or is there more to you than what you can actually see? What possibilities can manifest between our conscious and our unconscious? Somewhere in that deep void, that space between. Perhaps it is difficult for us to imagine. However, we have been told of the one whose arms have stretched as far from the east as from the west. That when they appear, they will come to us like a flash of lightning that illuminates that space between, and who calls us to walk upon the waters of the deep. So what should we say then when we're wandering the avenues of our minds and feeling lost? Will we ever see the warm glow of that pagoda in the distance like Casey had seen? when he was driving through the back alleys. Well, we must remind ourselves we are travelers. This would be the point of time, would it not? You must remind yourself that if you're feeling lost, it's because you left the place you were at and you're traveling to the place that you're going. And isn't it ironic that a compass with all four directions forms the cross? But what is most interesting is that its arrow is always pointing to true north. Think of your anxiety as that tension of the magnet, and that it will only settle when you move in the direction of that truth. If you want to find yourself, you have to keep moving in that direction. Where is the truth pulling you? And only you can tell where that is, where that's taking you for sure. Just keep an eye on those shadows, right? And maybe you'll find yourself settling in one place for a while. But before long, you may feel that pull again, calling you to move to the next. But remember, it's okay, because we're all on this journey together. So then we can imagine what constitutes that whole self, right? The full embodiment of what is sacred, mixed with that arcane substance, the material world. And when those two natures become one, when the proper intention and meaning becomes the incarnate body, there between we find love and the fruits of love's potential. This, I believe, is what is most sacred. This, I believe, is really the holy and infinite gift of God. Thank you, and God bless.